Okay, moving on to the next segment of today's show. I'm actually going to start a new segment for college basketball on the Zach Kroll Sports Podcast. And basically, as I mentioned in the intro, what I'm going to be doing today is for the Big East, and each episode it's going to be a different conference. I'm going to be ranking each team, each coach in the league, from top to bottom. And I'm going to tell you guys why. And in case you guys agree, in case you guys disagree, you guys know, feel free to hit me up. I know that the Big East has a lot of passionate fans. And without further ado, here we go. My number 10 head coach in the Big East is Dave Leto of DePaul. In 5 seasons with DePaul, he's gone 9-22, 9-23, 11-20, 19-17, and 13-16. His best accomplishment as the head coach of DePaul is CBI runner-up. And he has won the most conference games he's ever won in a season was 7. And the crazy thing is, last year, DePaul actually had some buzz around them. If you remember, they actually started off their season pretty well, and they had talent last year on their team with Paul Reed, with Romeo Weems, with Charlie Moore, with Jalen Coleman-Lance, and they actually started their season off 12-1. They went 12-1 in the non-conference, including a big-time road win over Minnesota, a big-time home win over Texas Tech, and a road win at Boston College, and a road win over Iowa. And then in the Big East, I don't know what happened. They just couldn't win a game. They lost game after game after game after game after game, and they finished their Big East season 3-15. The crazy thing about DePaul is if their season would have just, at least gone okay or decent, and their non-conference schedule, if they could have just maybe split, they could have maybe made the NCAA tournament, but instead, Dave Leto and them blew it. He's just not a good coach. I also heard throughout the offseason that their athletic director was considering giving him a possible contract extension. I really don't know what that's about, so my number 10 coach in the Big East is Dave Leto. My number 9 head coach in the Big East, and this could actually be a little controversial, but I'm curious what you guys think of this, and I'm putting this guy at 9, and maybe it's only because he's been on the job for only 2 years, but my number 2 guy is Travis Steele of Xavier. I haven't really been that impressed with what he's done since he's gotten to be the head coach of the Musketeers. Obviously, it's very hard to replace a guy like Chris Mack, a guy like that who has done just so much for your program. But at the same time, he took over a team for Xavier in 18-19 that should have been pretty good. That was a team that should have made the tournament. They had Najee Marshall, they had Tyreek Jones, they had Paul Scruggs, they had Zach Henkins, who was very good for them. They also had Quentin Gooden back as their starting point guard. And that Xavier team really struggled to start off their season. They missed the tournament, got blown out in a couple games by Cincinnati, by Missouri on the road. They had a 6-game losing streak in the middle of Big East play. And even though they finished the season okay and made it to the NIT, that wasn't a successful season. And then this past year, Xavier could have been a top 25 to a top 30 team, and they ended up on the bubble. Travis Steele hasn't overachieved in any of his 2 seasons at Xavier. Maybe he proves me wrong, but just the trajectory of that program and the way it's going, I have Travis Steele from Xavier as my number 9 head coach in the Big East. My number 8 head coach in the Big East, we will go to Georgetown and Patrick Ewing. And I liked Patrick Ewing, especially his first year or 2 at Georgetown. I think he's done a solid job, but it's a big year for him. And the problem is I don't really see this team getting any better anytime soon with Patrick Ewing as the head coach. This is a Georgetown team that in his first year went 15-15. In 18-19, they went 19-14 and made it into the first round of the NIT. And then this past year they went 15-17, and a 5-13 record in the Big East. And my thing was, if you guys remember, I was actually pretty high on Georgetown going into this season. They had James Akinjo, who was dynamic his freshman year. We all know what kind of player Mac McClung is. Omer Yurtseven's pretty good. Josh LeBlanc is pretty good. Jamarco Pickett, he's pretty good. They have some guys on this Georgetown team that could play, and they even showed some promise during last year when all of their guys got hurt and had a couple big wins. They went on the road to Oklahoma State and won literally the first game after all of their guys got suspended, but it didn't really continue as Georgetown ended their season with a 15-16 record and a 5-13 overall record, and ended their season by losing 7 games in a row. And that's just not a very good direction to be going into a season that's very important. And Patrick Ewing still hasn't made a tournament. He's done an okay job getting in talent. It's a big year for him if he really wants to show everyone in college basketball and the rest of the Big East how he is as a coach. He'll have Georgetown maybe close to the NCAA tournament this year, but at the same time, when you look at their roster and how much they've lost, I don't really see that happening. It's one thing to not win when you don't have good players early in your coaching tenure, but when you have guys like Mac McClung and James Akinjo leaving, who are probably your 2 best players, it's also known that Omer Yurtseven isn't coming back. You had Josh LeBlanc and Galen Alexander and Myron Gardner announcing they would leave the team as well. So it was just a mess of a season for Georgetown. Pat Ewing has never made an NCAA tournament as a Georgetown coach. He is my choice at number 8. At number 7, this could also be a little controversial, but I'm going to have Lavelle Jordan of Butler. To start off, Butler was in a hard spot when they decided to hire Lavelle Jordan because their coach, Chris Holtmann, ended up going to Ohio State, and that was a hire that was made in the middle of the offseason. So Ohio State didn't really have a choice. They got Chris Holtmann, who was the head coach of Butler at the time, and Lavelle Jordan ended up going to Butler. And I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that he went to Butler. A lot of it had to do with the fact that he was an okay coach at Milwaukee. But this is another guy that he was the coach of Milwaukee for 1 season, went 11-24 and 14-14 in conference, and then since he's gotten to Butler, he's been okay. He's made 2. He would have made the NCAA tournament this year. He made it in his first year, but Butler hit their peak very early this season. If you remember, they started off their season just red hot, winning game after game after game, had some big time wins over Minnesota and Missouri and Stanford and Ole Miss on the road and Florida. They were good, but then once Big East play hit, they had some tough losses, losing to Seton Hall at home, losing to DePaul on the road, getting smoked by 15 against Villanova, losing to Providence at home, losing to Georgetown at home. They've had a bunch of really tough losses, but at the same time, they did end their season okay, winning 3 games in a row, and if they would have made the NCAA tournament, if the Big East tournament would have indeed happened, I would have been very curious to see how exactly this Butler team would have done. But at the same time, Lavelle Jordan is kind of similar to Travis Steele. He's been on the job for a short while, and I haven't really seen him do anything to overachieve. But Butler, I was not very high on them this past season, and Lavelle Jordan proved me wrong with a good, not a great season. So I'm going to put him at number 7 in my list of Big East head coach power rankings. It's an interesting debate to have about where he should be along with Travis Steele, because once again, they're 2 guys that have just not been on the job for a very long time, but they haven't really done much otherwise to kind of put them over the hump. But with that being said, I'm going to put Lavelle Jordan at number 7 on my list. At number 6 on my list, I'm going to go with Steve Wojciechowski from Marquette. This is another coach that has been at Marquette for a couple of years now, and he's been all right, but I've never seen a Marquette Steve Wojciechowski team overachieve. This guy has gotten the Golden Eagles to 2 separate NCAA tournament appearances since he's become the head coach. And here's the problem. Both times they got run out of the building, and both times going into the game, they were the favorite to win. Now, you could say, okay, that first year in 2017, they lost in the first round to South Carolina, who, if you remember, actually ended up making the Final Four that year. And then the following year after that, 2 years after that, they ended up playing John Morant and Murray State in the first round of the NCAA tournament, and they didn't only lose, but they got ran out of the gym. You also combine that with the fact that Steve Wojciechowski has never really overachieved with the Marquette team, and let's see what this guy does without Marcus Howard. Marcus Howard is a phenomenal player. He's probably the best player to put on a Marquette uniform since Dwayne Wade. Are we in agreement there? If any Marquette fan wants to fight me on that, let me know. And Marcus Howard didn't win a tournament game during his career at Marquette. And it's obviously very unfortunate that he didn't have a chance to his senior year. But with how good of a player he was, the fact that he could never win an NCAA tournament game at Marquette, it's pretty upsetting. And I think a little of that blame has to go on Wojo. He's had some very talented teams, especially the team last year. The team with Marcus Howard, and also here's another thing. I got on Pat Ewing for letting some guys transfer. Why did the Hausers end up transferring? Did we ever figure that out? Because I'll tell you what, if the Hausers would have came back to Marquette this past year, along with Marcus Howard and Theo John, I think that team would have been pretty solid. No, they would have been a really good team. And unfortunately, Wojo just couldn't really keep the boys together. I have him as my number 6 head coach in the Big East. And at number 5, I'm going to have to go with Mike Anderson, the current head coach of St. John's. Mike Anderson's an interesting coach because St. John's, when they decided to hire Mike Anderson, they were in a tough spot, if you remember. Chris Mullin was he decided to leave very late in the offseason, and if you remember, St. John's was just interviewing candidate after candidate after candidate, and to be honest, really no one wanted the job. And then you look at Mike Anderson, this was a very interesting and a little bit of a controversial hire when St. John's decided to bring him in due to the fact that even though he was a good, not great coach with Arkansas and Missouri and UAB, those 3 places are the only 3 places that he's ever coached during his career, and he's never been coaching in a place like New York City where you need to recruit those kind of city kids and make them come to St. John's. But Mike Anderson, he got let go at Arkansas. Things were getting a little stale. He was fine. He never had a losing season, and I get that, and he deserves credit for that. The fact that he made it to the Elite Eight with Missouri once, and he has made it to the NCAA tournament a bunch of times. Mike Anderson, I think, is the definition of a safe hire. And I feel like when you're a school like St. John's, you've just been kind of struggling to stay relevant over the last couple seasons. And I actually think this program is going in the right direction when you look at, okay, even though LJ Figueroa transferred, they have some talent on this team. Some young talent that Mike Anderson is going to bring in. Julian Champagnie, he's a really good player. He was one of St. John's better players, especially towards the back end of last season. Rasheem Dunn is back for next year. Marcellus Erlington is another young kid I like. Josh Roberts, Greg Williams. So St. John's actually has some players, and I think Mike Anderson is a good basketball coach. Not a great basketball coach. He's usually not the coach that's going to get you to the Final Four and make that deep run. But to be honest, when you're a program like St. John's and you're in the spot where you are right now, then I think Mike Anderson is actually a good fit. If he could continue to recruit the talent throughout New York City, he's a good X's and O's basketball coach. I have him at number 5. At number 4, let's head to Creighton, and I'm going to go with Greg McDermott. And it's interesting. If you would have asked me to make this list, and I'm being honest when I say this, like 2-3 years ago, I think I would have had Greg McDermott way lower. But the reason why I moved him up is because last year was one of, I think, Greg McDermott's best coaching jobs since he's gotten to Creighton. I think it could probably be the best coaching job he's done since he's got to Creighton, and let me explain why. Going into last season, I expected Creighton to be like a back-end top 25 team, like an 8 or a 9 seed. And those, when you looked at things a little closer, those expectations did make some sense. The season before, they missed the NCAA tournament, made the NIT, but they did bring back some talent in Tyshawn Alexander and Zagorowski and Mitch Ballock. But I don't really think anyone expected Creighton, with after they lost their starting big man, Jacob Epperson, to go all the way to the top of the Big East and finish in a 3-way tie in first place. And I'm going to tell you guys this. If the NCAA tournament would have happened last year, I would have absolutely considered picking Creighton to go there. I'm dead serious. I think they're that talented of a basketball team. I think Zagorowski could play. I think Alexander could play. And unfortunately for them next year, Alexander's not going to be back, but Zagorowski and Ballock are to lead the way. And Greg McDermott, he's led his team to a couple NCAA tournaments prior to this one. Creighton has also had some bad injury luck as well as some bad luck in terms of guys deciding not to come back to school. When you look at Martin Krompel, when you look at Mo Watson getting hurt and tearing his ACL, you also remember the season when Doug McDermott was in college, Creighton had an early NCAA tournament exit. But over the last couple of years, Greg McDermott, especially last year, has really risen in terms of my Big East head coach power rankings. He is the guy I'm going to have at number 4. At number 3, let's have to Providence, and I'm going to say Ed Cooley. Let me ask you guys a question. Can you guys name me the teams off the top of your head that have made at least 6 out of the last 7 NCAA tournaments? You obviously have the teams that come to mind right away, the Blue Bloods, like the Duke and the Kentuckys and the Kansases. But what if I told you Ed Cooley and Providence was on that list? What if I also told you that Ed Cooley has a Big East tournament title? That's something not a lot of other people could say. And there are only 3 coaches in the Big East right now currently coaching that have won a Big East tournament title. And I'll give you a hint. They're my top 3 at the list. And Ed Cooley, he's a good coach. He's led Providence to be one of the more consistent programs, not only in the Big East, but in all of college basketball. And he's done a really nice job developing talent and getting them, in some cases like Chris Dunn, to the NBA. Ben Bentel was a big-time player also. What I also like about Ed Cooley is that he doesn't, when I say developing those guys, it's not always those guys that go to the NBA. When you look at Rodney Bullock, when you look at Kyron Cartwright, where those guys were their freshman year compared to their senior year is unbelievable. He also really did a nice job developing a star in Bryce Cotton. He had Chris Dunn, Junior Malumba on some of those Providence teams as well. I really like the head coaching job Ed Cooley has done. And when you forget, let's not forget, last year, going into the season, I kind of had Providence on the same realm as Creighton. I had them as like a back-end top 25 team, and they returned a lot of talent from the season before that missed the NCAA tournament, and it really didn't start off that well for the Friars last year. If you remember, they lost a game to Long Beach State. They then went on the road to Northwestern and got ran out of the gym, but they turned it around, and if the season and the NCAA tournament would have happened last year, I do believe the Friars would have made it. So Ed Cooley and his guys do deserve a lot of credit for that. I think Ed Cooley is one of the more underrated coaches nationally. I remember his name was brought up in the discussion with when Michigan last offseason that job opened. And Ed Cooley, I would have maybe had him at number 2, honestly, if I made this list 2 or 3 years ago. But he's a good coach. You know, he's not great. He's good, and I think he belongs at number 3. He has turned Providence into one of the more consistent programs. At number 2, let's go to Seton Hall. And I'm going to have Kevin Willard as my number 2 coach on this list. And when you're going to ask me why, it's interesting. I told you that my opinions on some of these coaches have really changed over the last 2-3 seasons. I think Kevin Willard is right at the top of this list. He wasn't great his first couple years at Seton Hall. I'll admit that. I was very critical of him, but each of the last 3 or 4 seasons, really since he had that dynamic recruiting class and they won the Big East title with Isaiah Whitehead, with Delgado, Carrington, Rodriguez, he's done a really good job developing talent with this program. And let me take you back to this. A couple of years ago, so this is the offseason going into 2018-2019. So going into that offseason, Seton Hall was losing a bunch of guys. They were losing Delgado. They were losing Rodriguez. They were losing Carrington. Kadeem Carrington. And basically, all they brought back was Miles Powell and a couple of role players that barely played minutes the season prior. And keep in mind, at this point, Miles Powell is not a star yet. He was like the 4th or 5th best player on the team the previous season. And Kevin Willard rallies the Pirates and gets them into the NCAA tournament in a tough Big East as a 10 seed. And they had a really good, successful regular season, also made it to the championship game of the Big East tournament. How about this year? Even though Seton Hall, I was high on them in the preseason and they ended up winning the Big East, let's not forget how they got there. You guys remember late in December when Miles Powell got the concussion against Rutgers and Mamu was hurt and Seton Hall looked done. You guys remember that, right? When they really were struggling and couldn't win a game. And then all of a sudden, they host Maryland without Miles Powell, without Mamu, and they beat them. And not only did they beat them pretty good. Guys like Romaro Gill, guys like Jared Roden, guys like Quincy McKnight, who stepped up all throughout last season, deserve a lot of credit, as does Kevin Willard. I have him at number 2. And then moving on to the coach that I have number 1 in the Big East, that would be Jay Wright of Villanova. This is clearly the number 1 coach in the Big East. Jay Wright has 2 national championships. No one in the Big East has one, no one else. And he's just an awesome coach. He's been doing this for such a long time, and he has really turned Villanova into one of the more consistent winners in all of college basketball. And it's also interesting because when you look at Villanova and where they were as a program when the old Big East became the new Big East, it was interesting because they were always good, they were always solid, they were always consistent, but they were never this, powerhouse team. And starting in that season, the first year of the new Big East, that was 2013-2014 to be exact, Jay Wright had Villanova at 29-5 and in overall, and then 16-2 in the Big East. They also went 33-3 the following year and 16-2 in the Big East, lost. But the catch is each of those 2 years, they actually lost in the round of 32. And I remember after that 2014-2015 season when Villanova lost to NC State in the round of 32, I remember saying to myself, is Jay Wright ever going to win in the tournament? This guy's been awful since he's been in the tournaments really over the last couple seasons. And this past season, and the following season, Villanova actually ended up winning the national championship on the buzzer beater by Chris Jenkins. And not a lot of people really thought that Villanova was really capable of getting that job done. So they go 35-5 and then 16-2 and end up winning the national championship. Ever since then, Jay Wright has gone 32-4, 36-4, and then a bad 26-10 season in 18-19, and then in 19-20, 24-7, and would have made a deep run in the NCAA tournament if it wasn't canceled. But yeah, Jay Wright has 2 national championships. He's been doing this for a long time. When you watch Villanova play, no matter what season it is, you always see how connected they are and how good their chemistry is and how quick they zip and just pass the ball around. They shoot. They're literally a basketball clinic. Jay Wright is honestly by far and away the best coach in the Big East and is definitely one of the 2 or 3 best coaches in all of college basketball. So to recap my list once again, my top 10 coaches in the Big East, so going from 1 to 10, I have Jay Wright of Villanova at number 1. I have Kevin Willard of Seton Hall at number 2. I have Ed Cooley of Providence at number 3. I have Greg McDermott of Creighton at number 4. I have Mike Anderson of St. John's at number 5. Steve Wojciechowski of Marquette at 6. Laval Jordan of Butler at 7. Pat Ewing of Georgetown at 8. Travis Steele of Xavier at 9. And Dave Leto of DePaul at 10.